They say Frozen was loosely inspired by Hans Christian Andersen's tale, The Snow Queen. Well, I've read Hans Christian Andersen's original tale, and let me say that loosely inspired is putting it mildly. Let's see just how much Disney transformed the Snow Queen into Frozen. Well, hello there! My name's Jeremy and welcome back to Freeform Disney, where I talk about all aspects of Disney, from the animated movies to the theme parks to Star Wars, Marvel, and Pixar, and the TV shows, and everything else in between. And that is why it's Freeform. And keep coming back every day for new daily content. If you're not subscribed yet, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Now on to today's topic, Frozen. The loosely, very loosely inspired movie by the original tale, The Snow Queen. Disney's Frozen was released in 2013, and it was touted in part as being loosely based on or inspired by Hans Christian Andersen's old fairy tale, The Snow Queen. The Snow Queen was published way back in December of 1844, and is actually one of the longest Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales published. His fairy tale is broken up into 7 stories, which are really just consecutive chapters of the tale. I'm going to refer to them probably as chapters from here on out, just to make it less confusing. I'm going to give you some of the broad strokes of the original tale when it comes to this comparison and skip over large parts of it, because not a whole lot of that tale really made it into Frozen, but we're going to go through it. Here, put it another way. If you had told me Frozen was not based on or inspired by the Snow Queen, I could have easily believed the couple small similarities were coincidental. That's how different these two are. But let's talk about it. Here we go. The original tale, The Snow Queen, an adventure in 7 stories. The first story, which is about the mirror and the fragments. So the tale begins like this. All right, now we'll begin. When we're at the end of the story, we'll know more than we know now. For we'll know just how evil this troll was. He was one of the absolute worst. He was the devil himself. One day, he was in a really good mood because he had made a mirror that caused everything good and beautiful it reflected to shrink to almost nothing, and anything that was worthless and ugly to stand out and look even worse. Well, you can tell right off the bat that this is not sounding very much like Frozen. And well, this whole section here doesn't. Yes, I guess there are trolls. Hey look, there's a troll. There are trolls. These are certainly not Frozen trolls. They're not even close. Let's take this a little further. That mirror that was designed, trolls tried taking it all the way up to heaven to go shine it on God and the angels. But they ended up dropping it and it broke. And then the book continues on. Some of the pieces were no bigger than a grain of sand. And these flew about in the world. And when they got into people's eyes, they stayed there. And people saw everything wrong. Or only had an eye for what was wrong with the thing, since every little piece of mirror retained the power of the whole. Some people also got a little piece of the mirror in their hearts, and it was quite dreadful. The heart became like a clump of ice. Now you might see a similarity right there. Beware the frozen heart. So this definitely looks like a piece that inspired Frozen a little bit. Although clearly in Frozen, we're not talking about little pieces of mirror going into someone's heart, turning it into ice. But nevertheless, a heart getting turned to ice is clearly super relevant in the movie. Then we move on to the second chapter, and that's where the main story really starts. It's titled A Little Boy and a Little Girl, and it introduces our main characters of Gerda and Kai, which the book says, they weren't brother and sister, but they loved each other as if they were. Now, you might think this directly inspired Anna and Elsa's relationship as sisters in the movie, and I've certainly seen people who said as much, but I really don't think that would actually be accurate. Now the reason is because Elsa is modeled after the barely seen Snow Queen from the book, while Anna seems to be modeled after Gerda, and Kai really pretty much disappeared as a character. And this is really shown in the early drafts of the movie script, where we've been told that Elsa was actually a far more two-dimensional villain, at least until the end of the movie where Hans is revealed to be the true villain and Elsa has to save the day. But meanwhile, Anna and Elsa weren't royalty, and they weren't even related in the early drafts. So to say that Anna and Elsa's relationship is supposed to be like Gerda and Kai seems really off, as the early drafts of the script had nothing of that in there. In fact, Elsa was the Snow Queen, not Kai. Now you might ask, just for a second, why Snow Queen? Why are we calling it that in the first place? Well, actually, it's a reference from Gerda and Kai's grandmother to snowflakes being like white bees. Therefore, the snow has a queen too, just like bees do. So it's the Snow Queen. And Kai ends up seeing the Snow Queen later that evening, and this is the description of how she was dressed. She was dressed in the finest, whitest gauze, as though she were made of millions of star-like specks. Now this sounds so like it inspired Elsa's beautiful ice dress. You know, the one she makes for herself during Let It Go? That really beautiful dress? I would be surprised if that didn't help inspire it. Now, much of the rest of the description of the Snow Queen is completely alien to Elsa. Apparently, the Snow Queen was made of dazzling ice, although she was alive, and the Snow Queen could fly. Now, I've seen an elephant fly, but I ain't ever seen no Elsa made of ice fly. As the book goes on, Kai then gets two of those mirror particles stuck in him. One goes into his eye and one in his heart. And then his heart would soon become like a clump of ice. And then he, unsurprisingly, becomes an asshole. Later, he goes out sledding and ends up essentially getting kidnapped by the Snow Queen. Now, there's an interesting line as Kai was being kidnapped that reminded me of the movie, although it certainly very well might be coincidental. The Snow Queen says to Kai, "Are you still cold?" And then she kissed him on the forehead. Oh, it was colder than ice. It went right into his heart, which of course was partly a clump of ice. He felt like he was going to die, but only for a moment. Then it felt good, and he didn't notice the cold around him anymore. The cold didn't bother Kai anymore. I can't help but have that go through my head when I read that section. I'm not saying that that actually inspired that section, but it certainly goes through my head. Although I've also got to note, the cold not bothering Kai has a great bit of dark undertone to it. If you were to apply that undertone to Elsa and Let It Go, it would become almost like her internalizing all the negativity from everyone else to the point that she becomes numb to it. Definitely not as nice. Yeah. Back to the book. In the next chapter, we find out that everyone thinks Kai is dead, but little Gerda sets out to save him and thus begins her mighty adventure. This is headstrong Gerda to go save the day, much like our good Anna. There's definitely a similarity between the two in that sense in going out to save the day, even if Anna was headed out to save Elsa, based on the Snow Queen, while Gerda was headed out to save Kai, captured by the Snow Queen. A little bit of difference. So then the fairy tale goes through chapter after chapter of delays along her journey to go save Kai. Each chapter focuses on one of these different delays. First, there's an old woman in a garden of talking flowers. Then she has an adventure with crows and a prince and a princess. Next, she meets a little robber girl in the forest. A little robber girl and her reindeer Bay, that is. And that's so similar to Kristoff and Sven that you can barely even tell the difference. I mean, who doesn't remember those scenes in Frozen where Kristoff kept threatening Sven by putting a knife to his throat? Or when Kristoff told Anna that he would kill her himself if he ever got angry at her. Kristoff and his psychotic hijinks, am I right? Oh wait, that wasn't in Frozen, was it? Yeah. As I said earlier, Frozen is very loosely inspired by the Snow Queen. But hey, there's a reindeer in both. Anywho, then Gerda and Bay, the reindeer, travel north to Lapland, where the Snow Queen has her castle. Actually, her summer castle. Lapland covers an area similar to where Frozen is set in Norway. This definitely seems to be the inspiration for where Frozen takes place, and they've talked about as much. Then Gerda and Bay go on a little bit longer questing to find their way to the castle for a better part of a chapter. And then they finally have Gerda go by herself off to the Snow Queen's castle. She has a big fight with the Snow Queen's snowflake army. She wins that fight by saying the Lord's Prayer and having a whole host of angels come and destroy the snowflake army. Given that, it might not come as a big surprise that the author Hans Christian Andersen was quite religious. Certainly not true of the movie Frozen. That said, there's a definite similarity here. The early drafts of Frozen would have had Elsa with an army of snow monsters in the finale. Her snow monster army definitely seems to be inspired from that piece in the original fairy tale. But in the book, the Snow Queen was not there during the battle, nor was she defeated in the end of the book. She was just kind of off somewhere else during that whole time. Another definite difference between the original tale and the movie. And here's an interesting similarity. The castle was made out of snow over in the original fairy tale, and ice in the movie. While not the same, we can definitely see some more direct inspiration between the snow castle and the ice castle here. And this isn't just some tiny snow castle. This is a giant mansion with apparently some rooms that are miles long. They're huge. So it's even bigger than Elsa's castle. Then we move on to saving poor old Kai. And how was the frozen heart of Kai melted? Well, it was hot tears from Gerda that fell onto Kai's chest and melted his frozen heart. Definitely a little bit cliche and definitely different than the movie Frozen. I'm only far too happy that it's vastly different in the movie, as that was a truly great moment in Frozen. Now there may be one more inspiration from the original tale to the movie. Kai had been told by the Snow Queen that if he could write the word eternity, the Snow Queen would free him, give him the world, and a new pair of skates. I'm curious if this was an inspiration for the ice skating scene at the end of Frozen, where Elsa gives Anna a pair of ice skates. I could definitely see it being one. Now, there may have been other inspirations that I missed in there, simply because I don't know what the original draft of Frozen looked like before it has changed as much as it did in draft after draft revision to get to where we got to at the end. Oh, here's a fun one. A little bonus piece of trivia for you. The movie gave one more bonus nod to the original fairy tale by having two characters in it that were named Kai and Gerda. Pretty neat. In the end, The Snow Queen is a light adventure tale with some messages it wants to impart on its audience, and a tale which meanders and takes far too many detours, which often feel meaningless and as if they were there simply to pad the runtime of the fairy tale, shall we say. I can't say as I recommend reading the original tale, but it is a classic, and it's still enjoyable enough to make it through it. And so that is Hans Christian Andersen's very, very, very different tale of the Snow Queen versus our current movie of Frozen. I, for one, am only too incredibly happy that Frozen looks nothing like its original inspiration, as I adore the movie Frozen and a great many of the choices it made. My hat goes off to Jennifer Lee and everyone else involved in writing and creating this movie, and for them taking the time going through draft after draft after draft and being willing to scrap entire major portions of the script and rework it until we got the movie we know now. I'm quite happy with how Disney transformed the Snow Queen to bring us Frozen. What about you? Have you read Hans Christian Andersen's The Snow Queen? Are there any elements of it that you wish had made it into Frozen but didn't? Or maybe you actually think that it was an amazing fairy tale and you wish Disney had made a movie about the Snow Queen instead of Frozen? Well, let me go ahead and know down below in the comments. And thanks for watching. If you liked the video, go ahead and give it a like, share it with some of your friends, and I'll see you back here again tomorrow for another new episode of Freeform Disney. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell. Have a magical day, everyone, and may the Force be with you, always.